Hello everyone. This is a video walkthrough that will show the process of creating an annotated bibliography for your guided research paper. So, an annotated bibliography is not just a homework assignment. It's more than a list of the sources that you'll use in your paper. It's more like a critical thinking exercise that helps you organize your research, demonstrate how well you understand it, and connect those sources to your thesis. So let's take a closer look at what an annotated bibliography is before we learn how to create one. So what exactly is an annotated bibliography? It's basically just a list of bibliographic entries to books, articles, and other sources, with each citation followed by a third-person paragraph-length summary of a source written for someone who's not read or seen that source. And then after that, you follow that with an evaluation of that source, but we'll modify that just a little bit for our purposes in this class. And the whole point of that annotation is twofold. And the first is to summarize that source objectively and without any opinion from you. So the point is to present that to somebody else. It has to be accurate, clear, and concise. And second, the point is to explain how that source contributes to the development and support of your thesis. And so what this does is it helps you organize your research, and it demonstrates to your reader that you've critically evaluated your sources and that you've thought about how you'll use them to develop specific points in your paper. For our assignment, your annotated bibliography will have four key components. At the top of the assignment, you'll have a working thesis, and this is a single declarative sentence that presents the point that you're trying to support and develop in the paper. And you'll have entries, 6 MLA formatted bibliographic entries. So these are basically works cited entries for each one of your sources. They'll be in alphabetical order. And after each one, there'll be a paragraph of an objective summary for each one, and then followed by that there will be an original contribution from you and in a different color explaining how each source connects to your thesis. So you can't even begin to build an annotated bibliography until you develop a working thesis, your point that you're going to prove, based on one of the prompts first. So it's kind of a lot like cooking dinner. You can't actually cook dinner till you decide what you're going to make. And then once you decide what you're going to make, then you can choose ingredients and gather those and set about the process of actually cooking dinner. So it's a kind of a very similar process for an annotated bibliography. Got to decide what your point's going to be first, then you choose your sources, and then you can kind of figure out how it's all going to come together. So let's take a look at how to develop a working thesis. The first step to creating an annotated bibliography is to develop a working thesis. And this is just a preliminary version of your main argument that will guide not only your research but also the development of your paper. And you have to keep in mind that it's called a working thesis for a reason. It doesn't have to be pretty or perfect. It just needs to contain the specific and precise point that you will develop in your paper. We have all the opportunity in the world to refine and revise that thesis before it becomes the thesis for the final draft. So there are two methods that I showed in the lessons for how to create one. And one method is to create a formulaic stem that sort of lays out all of your points to help you see the basic structure. And then the other method is an umbrella thesis, which is a little bit broader, but it's something that's still precise enough that underneath that you still have room for your very specific points that would fall under that. And It's also really important to remember that you don't usually develop a thesis out of the blue or out of thin air. It's not something that just comes to you in a vision. You have to do the preliminary research, which is what you did prior to this step. So we devoted a whole week to allowing you to explore the TED Talks and explore the articles and the excerpts from articles or from longer works to see which ones you want to use. And we need to remember that for this particular paper, at least 3 of the sources need to come from the column of print sources or articles, and the other 3 can come from the TED Talks. So by this point, hopefully you've read the articles and watched all the videos in our common pool of sources that we can choose from for this paper. Remember that we can't do any outside research. I'm taking one thing kind of off your plate so that we can just focus on the process. And so to illustrate or to review how to do this, let's take a look at 2 of the prompts on the assignment sheet, both of which present interesting research question. So one of the prompts on the assignment sheet asks what we can learn from our fears. Now, the answer to that question will become your thesis, and the answers are found in the sources. That doesn't mean you can't contribute to them later, but the actual answers of what we can learn from our fears will come from the sources. You have to extract those things. And the same is true for the other prompt, which kind of asks us, how can we mitigate, manage, or overcome some of the fears that hold us back? And so if we flip that and turn that into a statement and say we can mitigate, manage, or overcome some of the fears that hold us back by doing A, B, C, and D, then we're using that to kind of map out our basic points. And that's the same thing that we would do for the other one, which is the one you see on the screen here. And for this one, we have just a formulaic stem to help us establish our points. We can learn blank, 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 and blank from our fears. And filling in those blanks, those answers come from the sources. So you have to be able to extract the lessons from the sources if you're choosing this one. If you're choosing the other one about how to mitigate, manage, or overcome fears, you have to look for or be able to extract, well, what are the strategies? What are the techniques? What is the specific thing that people can try or do to manage those things a bit better? Now, we also have an open-ended prompt on the assignment sheet, so you're not limited to prompts 1 or 2, but whatever you come up with for prompt 3, if you want to come up with your own angle, it has to be something that lends itself to being developed and supported from the sources that I've provided you. But I will say there's a lot of leeway and a lot of things that you can do with those. So we can't create an annotated bibliography at all until or unless you have a working thesis in place. You must know what it is that you're going to prove. You have to know which prompt you're responding to, and you got to know what the answers to are to your research question before you can even begin to decide, okay, well, which of the sources that I've seen am I actually going to use in the paper. So we need to do this first before we can do anything else. All right, so now let's take a look at what comes after once I have developed the working thesis. Next, you'll need to choose the 6 sources chosen from our common pool of sources on the Fear Unit Padlet and create alphabetized bibliographic entries in MLA format for each one. So this is basically a works cited page, or back in my day, they just called it a bibliography, and that's kind of where the title for this assignment comes from. It's an annotated bibliography. It's basically just a works cited page with a paragraph or 2 after each entry, one explaining what it's about and the other one explaining how you're going to use that in your paper specifically to develop certain points. So each entry should be alphabetized by the author or the TED Talk speaker's last name. And there are 2 or 3 ways that you can go about figuring out how to create these entries, but they all boil down to one thing. You got to look it up. If you were to email or message me on Pronto and ask me how to cite one of the sources, that's what I have to do to help you, is I have to look it up, because nobody in their right mind memorizes exactly what goes in what order for every kind of source that you could have, whether it's a video, an article, a book, and all the various super specific kinds of sources that you could have. So the short version of this is that you have to look it up. How do I create an MLA bibliographic entry for this kind of source that I have? But I'm going to give you some tips on some places to look and some things that you can do, and you'll probably use a combination of these things to figure out how to create the bibliographic entries. So the first one is obviously to just look it up the old school way, either in an MLA handbook, which you can usually find those in your college library or even in your local library, like a hard copy MLA manual. But most people probably don't do that. There's a lot of good, reliable sources on the internet that you can use, and I will show you a couple of those. So I'll tell you about a couple of them right now, and then I'll show you in a moment. But one of them is called the Purdue Online Writing Lab, or Purdue OWL, like the bird, for short. So if you type that in the URL search bar and type in Purdue OWL, you'll come up to this writing website that's very highly regarded, and they have answers to just about anything you might want to ask about MLA format and APA format, as well as various things about writing certain kinds of papers and things like that. Really good resource, highly respected, and you can look things up there the old school way by just kind of searching for, how do I create a works cited entry in MLA format for this certain thing that I have, whether it's a website, an article, a video, a TED Talk, what have you. And then it'll provide you with an example, and you follow that formula. It's kind of like, plugging in numbers to a math formula. You follow the order of the example, with your author's last name, comma, first name, period, then the name of the article, and then the rest of the information where the article can be found, and all the publication information. So that's one. The Purdue Online Writing Lab is a good place to look up how to do create certain kinds of entries. And another one is called Scribber, and that's spelled SCRIBBER. That's another really good website that has a lot of videos, and they have a lot of kind of quick reference things that are very reliable that you could look on there. You can also use AI to help you with these things if you're willing to check the results. So a lot of times AI will get it right, or it'll come pretty close, and then you can just check and make minor adjustments. And then also they have the online citation generators, which I used to use those back in the day, but I have stopped doing that because they make just enough errors for me to find it aggravating. So I honestly find it easier to do one of two things. To, number one, look up how to do it on the Purdue Online Writing Lab and just follow that formula. And like, let's say once I learn how to do one TED entry, then I'm following that same formula for the other two and putting those in alphabetical order. So super easy. Once you do one of those, then the other two are really easy. For the articles, it's kind of got to depend on which ones you're using and where they're coming from, because there are going to be some differences between those. But I'll show you the ropes for those. For example, there's one of our articles, which I think probably everybody should probably use this one, and it's called 10 Ways We Get the Odds Wrong. And that's actually an article that's available to us in the STC databases. That's where I got it from, and so that's where you'll want to cite that one from. And basically you navigate to that one in the databases, and you click on the little cite button that they have, which looks like quotation marks, and then you choose the citation style you're using, which for us is MLA 9th edition currently, and then it will come up, and you copy paste that into your works cited page on your paper, and then you just need to clean it up. So it's not going to be in Times New Roman, but it's super easy to put it in the correct font, make sure it's double spaced, and make sure the second, third, fourth lines, however many there are beyond the first one, make sure those are indented for the hanging indent. So it's super easy to fix those. So it's not hard to create the bibliographic entries for them, but it does take you got to look up how to do them, and you've got to alphabetize them, and so that is the first step. You've got to create those before you can go back in and add your summary and your evaluation and explanation of how you're going to use it. Now, you don't have to do those all at once if you don't want to. You can do one bibliographic entry and then do your summary and then do your explanation of how you're going to use it and then do another. Or you can just, it may actually even be more efficient if you do all your bibliographic entries first, put them in ABC order. You got all those correct. That's the hard part, honestly, and it's not even hard. And then you can go back in and put your paragraphs in there that are required for the rest of it. So that's this step. So after this, let me pause from the slides and show you how to do some of this stuff. Okay, let me show you some of the tricks and strategies that you can use to create the bibliographic citations for some of these sources. So the first one I'm going to show you is Copilot, and I have a TED Talk that I brought up over here, and I have it running in the background, but I'm just going to go ahead and stop that. And I've already used Copilot here to save time in the video. I'm in Edge browser, so if you want to be able to use Copilot in the Edge browser, you need to be in Edge and you need to click on the little Copilot icon over to the right, and what this does is it brings out a slide out chat, and this is Microsoft's AI chatbot. And one of the things that makes it particularly useful is that it is this sidebar feature that it can interact with the content that you have in your screen. So if you could bring up a PDF up here and you can interact with that. You can also interact with videos or ask questions about it. So notice one thing I did here, I asked it to create an MLA 9th edition style bibliographic entry for this particular TED Talk. And it did do that, and it's pretty close. You won't have, so if I were to copy paste this, I would have to clean up the formatting a little bit. This part shouldn't be in bold, for example. I would have to make sure this is in Times New Roman. And then once I copy paste this into my Works Cited page, obviously I have to alphabetize it, and then I'm going to hit the tab key on the second and third lines so that those tab in. That's called the hanging indent, but it's pretty darn close to what it needs to be. It's got the author, last name, comma, first name, period, the name of the TED Talk, the name of the specific TED conference that it happened, a date if there's one available, and the URL. The only other thing that I ask that you put in addition to this is the date of access. That's not all professors ask for that, but I do. And you just need to choose a date that makes sense. So something between when we started this unit and before the annotated bibliography is due, or later, when you're putting these entries on your paper. So this is a pretty good and quick way to get, probably a pretty close entry for many of your works cited entries, but you are responsible for double checking and making sure that they are correct. If you remember from our discussion previously, I am okay with you using AI to get the third person summary of the article, so Copilot is also a good choice for that. But keep in mind, you have to tell it what you want. So in this case, I said write a summary of what the article is about. This is for an annotated bibliography and must contain the upshot and basics of Thompson Walker's claims and an overview of how she presents that, the analogies she uses. Keep it to one paragraph. Now this part I wouldn't have been able to put in if I hadn't already seen this video. I wouldn't have been able to kind of tailor the way I wanted it. I love this video because she uses the analogies and she likens, fears to stories that we tell ourselves, and she empowers us to think about how we can reframe our thinking about those things so that maybe we can write better ending to the stories that we tell ourselves. In other words, the fears that we can have better control over them if we can analyze them. So I really loved that and wanted that included in the paragraph. So I would have to read this to see if this passes muster for me before I decide putting it into the annotated bibliography. But that's one choice and one AI tool. The other thing I want to show you, I want to bounce into our class. Most people will probably want to use one of the articles in the unit, in our fear unit, and that's 10 ways we get the odds wrong. And I want to show you, so that one's here in the Padlet resources. If I click on this one though, I got it from the STC databases. So the nice thing about this is that if you choose it, I've got a direct link. You're just going to click on the link to the databases. If you're off campus, it might prompt you to sign in to the databases. And if it does, you just do that. You want to click on the citation button, and then you'll scroll down here and look for the one that says MLA, which is right here. And then all I have to do is I'm going to copy paste this, and I guess I could clip. I can do this, clip to the clipboard. Then I'm going to paste that into my works cited page, and I can just eyeball this and tell that it's correct. It's got the author, the name of the article is in quotation marks, the period is inside, that's correct. The name of the publication that it appears in, Psychology Today, is italicized, that's correct. Then it's got the specific volume, the number, the issue, the year, the page number. It actually should have the page span here. So this is, a small thing that's easy to correct because you have the actual article and can look at the page numbers on the bottom, and then here is the URL that goes to that in there. And the only thing that I ask that you add on top of that is the date of access, and I have an example of that right here. So even if you take a moment to pause the video, you can see here's what it looks like when it's in an annotated bibliography, and then there's the date of access. Here is the third person summary. This one I did by hand, and then here is the part in blue that is explaining how that can be used. I might take the time to read this one to kind of show what we're aiming for in the blue part. The main claims and examples in this article fit right in with the thesis. The whole article is about learning how to analyze, evaluate, and accurately assess fears and make better decisions as a result. This can help build a background section that establishes the problem of fear and how we often assess danger wrongly. The example of how we fear cancer but not heart disease, the consequences of which are remote, and thus not frightening, is a good example to illustrate that point. But I can also add or tie in the idea of productive paranoia, which is referenced in other sources to be used in this paper to show one way to harness and overcome it. So I'm doing a couple of things here. Not only am I explaining how it ties into the thesis, which if we look in the example on this one, that says people can overcome many of their fears by analyzing and evaluating them. I'm explaining how this one ties into that. I'm explaining how I can use this in a background section that establishes, what are some of the problems of fears. And so I would do that to use this source to help do that, and that helps set a rationale for me presenting some strategies or techniques that can be used to either overcome them if we can, and if not, maybe mitigate the negative impacts or to manage them a bit better. But I'm also making a connection to other sources that I've chosen and other concepts. So I'm already, this is a really good thinking exercise. It's already letting me make those connections. So this will show you how to cite two different sources. Now I just need to show you the last one. So give me a second to call those up, and then I think you'll have everything that you need. Okay, so the rest of the print articles come from the fear issue of Lapham's Quarterly, which is a journal that has a print component, but it also has an online component, and all of the articles that I got for our use come from the online version, but I also have the hard copy. So to create entries for the little shorter excerpts and the things that come from Lapham's Quarterly, and you can tell when you click on those and you scroll to the bottom, you can tell which ones those are. You'll have to click on this to get some of the basic information for there. So we can see that the fear issue is volume X number 3, summer of 2017. You'll need that information along with the author of your article and along with the title of the article. You'll need those things, and then you'll also need the URL of the specific article that you are using. So this is one of the articles that's on the Padlet called Petrified Forest. So let's just say that I chose that one. Then as part of my entry, I'm going to need the URL for that. I'm going to have to grab that. And I also need to know, which part of which journal it came from, volume 10, number 3, summer of 2017. And then I could go to a website like Purdue OWL and I could look up how do I create an entry for that. So you have the basic tools to, and you could even try, you could try AI, you could try Copilot, you can try Gemini. Now, Gemini, the great thing about Copilot is it can look and see what you've got on your screen, and so that's a convenient option. If you're looking at Gemini or Claude, now they can search the internet, and so you could give them enough information. You could provide the URL and try them to see how they do on creating an entry, but again, proofread it and check it against other sources. And don't forget that you can look at places like Purdue OWL, and this is Purdue OWL or Scribber. I tend to use Purdue OWL quite a bit. They've got an MLA guide, and they also have the ability for you to search on here. So once you click on MLA guide, you can, kind of search and dial deeper down in that. So now you have the basics of how to create and where to go to find how to create those bibliographic entries. Purdue OWL, you can go straight to the STC databases and so on. And if we click on a couple of things over here, so this one is an actual student annotated bibliography, and this was her thesis. Although fear can affect us physically and mentally, we can use both the mind and body to overcome our fears. Now that's kind of a broad thesis. It's not really the formulaic one, but it was certainly okay for this this first one here, and she did a really good job. And I also want to say one of the most gratifying things about allowing the use of AI for the summaries, and the students are allowed to do this too when you're processing the articles, is the student that you see whose work is featured on this screen. She had a learning disability. It was a processing disability, and she told me that it just takes her longer to process things, and sometimes certain things that she reads are harder to understand, and she has to work harder to decode those. So after she read all the things and watched all the things in the Padlet, there were a couple of things that she kind of wanted to use, but she didn't fully understand them. And she told me, she said, the ability to go in and get a summary and get a breakdown, she said, then I understood fully what those articles were about, so that when I went back to read them a second, a third, a fourth time, she said, now I could go in and focus and find the things that I wanted to use in the paper. And she said it was a game changer for me. And she got an A not only on this assignment, but she got an A in the course, and she was working with greater challenges than maybe many of us are working with. And it's great for everybody. It doesn't do the work for you, but this is exactly how I see this as being ethical. She'd already read those articles, and where it really helped her quite a bit was in the articles where, and they're usually the ones from the Lapham's Quarterly, that are harder to process, and that allowed her to increase her understanding and then actually dive deeper into those sources once she went back to them second and subsequent times. But you see here, this is hers, and she's got her summary, she's got her explanations, and so on. So if we scroll all the way through this, hers was about 5 pages in length, so that's probably going to be about the length of yours. Could be a little bit longer, but that's a good rule of thumb because she's got nice length summaries. She did use AI for the summaries. Notice she's citing them correctly. And the semester that we did this one, I had only shown them Copilot, so I think they had a tendency to do that. But you're free to use Gemini, Claude, Copilot. I just ask that when we're doing these, it's not that I care that you use ChatGPT, but for our official uses, I really want you to try out the other ones, the ones that maybe people are less likely to have tried out. But you can always, use that as an add-on or as an addition to kind of see how they compare. That's a useful activity too. So these things combined show you a little bit more cohesively what we're aiming for, what this assignment looks like, and you'll see other examples of these in the course and whatnot. But this is the aim, and it's one of the most practical things that we'll do. And the option to use AI on the summaries will save you time on this part so that you can do the more important work of being able to explain how and what you're going to use from that source to develop a given point. Once you have the bibliographic entry for a source done, now it's time for you to write an objective third-person summary just in a regular black Times New Roman font. And this summary should be free from factual errors. It needs to be free from any personal opinions or evaluations from you. It just needs to be a straight up summary written for somebody not familiar with the source, because the true purpose of an annotated bibliography in a class like this one is so that I can see your thesis, I can see which sources you're using, and I can get a sense of what your vision is for how you plan to use those sources to develop your thesis. Now, in a regular research paper where I haven't read or seen all of the sources, or where you've got other professors that haven't seen those things, it's really crucial that the summaries of those sources are accurate. And a summary is considered a low-level skill, but it's actually a lot harder to pull off than many people might imagine. A lot of times people don't step back enough from the forest to kind of be able to see the big picture of a source, and it's actually harder to write a really good summary than most people realize. People tend to maybe bounce around an article, bounce around a video and say, oh, well, it talks about this and it talks about that, but they're not truly presenting a summary. So when you're writing your summary, you need to focus on capturing the main points, the key upshots of the argument that that given person is making, key examples from that source, and it should be a good paragraph. So it's not going to be like a super long paragraph, but neither should it be 3 sentences. It should be a good solid paragraph kind of capturing the main arguments. So this is the objective summary part, and this will be in black, and then I'll talk about the other part that you need to add to this. But before we do that, in the next slide, I want to talk about an option that I'm going to allow for this assignment that I think you'll like. And although it won't be required, I will encourage you to consider using AI to do the summary for you. And I'll talk about that in the next point. If you recall back at the beginning of the semester, you might remember me telling the class that I'm very AI forward and that I see a lot of ethical use cases for it even in a learning environment, and this is one of those times. So I am going to allow everybody the option to use AI such as Claude, Copilot, or Gemini, for example. Notebook LM is another choice as well. But I think using Claude, Copilot, or Gemini, all of those are good sources for the summary, and I'll show you those. If you're probably familiar with some of these, but you may not be familiar with all of them. And notice that I leave ChatGPT off the list, not because I don't like it. It's very good. I have a paid subscription to it, but I also have subscriptions to the other ones as well. But all of them have their strengths and their weaknesses, and so anytime we use AI, I will usually limit that use to Claude or Gemini, sometimes maybe Copilot, and other times Notebook LM, because I figure most everybody already has experience with ChatGPT, which is very good also, but these other ones also have, their strengths as well. So if you use one of these, the advantage of that is that it's taking one thing off your plate. It will write an accurate summary. You do need to read over it, and you might need to edit it, or you might need to iterate more than one time, asking for that summary to get it in a form that you like. So you do have to specify the tone. You need to specify the length. If you want it to focus on certain things that you are going to focus on in your paper, do that. But this is for the straight up summary. So this will be quite a time saver. And this is not unlike what, rich people and politicians do when they pay interns and recent college grads, or people that are just kind of starting out in their career, to read really long documents for them and summarize them. Now, you can't or should not use this to summarize the articles and the TED Talks if you haven't read them. So the only reason that I'm allowing this is because I'm assuming that you've read these sources and that you've already made the choices in terms of which ones you want to use. So this is going to save you some time in writing those summaries. You can copy paste them into your document. You are going to have to cite them, and I will show you specifically how to do that. You're going to, for example, if you have a summary written by Claude, you will have a line, at the beginning of that summary saying summary written by Claude, and then in parentheses you'll have the company that makes that AI tool, which in this case would be Anthropic. Or if you were using Copilot, summary written by Copilot, you'd put Microsoft in parentheses. And you're just being like straight up honest about the fact that, hey, you were allowed to use AI to write the summary and you took advantage of that. Do read it over though to make sure if it's not to your liking, either edit it by hand or keep iterating with AI until it's in a form that you like. Because the most important part of the annotated bibliography comes after this part, and that part has to be 100% done by you. And that's the part where you explain not only how you're going to use that source to develop a given point in your paper, but what specifically you'll use from the source to do that. I mean, you may not have all the answers of the minutia that you'll use from that source, but you need to kind of have an overarching sense of how you'll use that. Kind of like if you're creating a new dish in the kitchen, maybe you're going to make some kind of tomato-based sauce. Maybe you don't know yet what all you're going to put into it until you start putting things in and tasting it and whatnot. But from the outset that you're going to make a tomato-based sauce of some kind. So I need to at least see the direction that you're going for with the use of each of these sources. But this is a pretty generous offer here to let you use AI do the summary, and I encourage you to take advantage of it. I do think it's an ethical use for this. All right, let's on to the next and see what we need to do after we have the third person objective summary. After you've written the objective summary for a given source, then right after that you'll add your original contribution in a colored font, like a dark blue or a blue that's dark enough to see easily. And this is the part where you explain how the source connects to your thesis and how it contributes to your to a given point in the paper. This is where you demonstrate your vision for the source. You'll be explaining how you'll use it and what specifically you'll use, at least in a kind of general sense, but being as specific as you can. And I will show you examples of this so that you know what the aim is. And the reason that I have you color code this and some other things that I have us do in the class is I want us to always be mindful of the distinction between what we're saying and what we're using from a given source. Now, we'll never do this in a final draft for a paper, but a lot of times in the process work, I want you to see when and where you're actually contributing and when and where you're deriving something from a source. That's why our source summaries are going to be in a black font and why your contribution is going to be in a blue font. Now, in terms of where this goes, you may not have a whole paragraph worth of explanation, but you should have maybe 3 or 4 lines or so to explain how you're going to use a given source. If you can sustain a whole paragraph, then you can, create a separate paragraph in that different color. But if you still have room in your original paragraph, you can just put your 3 to 4 lines right after the part in black, and the part in blue signifies that it's you. So that's why another reason I like to use blue here is because blue means you. That's your contribution and your your explanation of how you're going to use that source in your paper. And let me be clear that you can't say, I will use this source to back up my points in this paper. That's already a given. I already know that. So I need to know specifically how you're going to use it, and specifically what are you going to use and for what point. So I need to see the critical thinking that has gone behind the choice that you have for that given source for the thesis that you have presented. So we're almost to the conclusion of this, but I got a few more things to clarify, and then you'll be ready to start working on the annotated bibliography. Okay, in this slide, you'll see some really truncated versions of MLA bibliographic entries for different kinds of sources. For books, for instance, you'll include the author's name, last name, comma, first name, period. The book titles go in italics, publisher, publication year, and so on. So that's kind of like the basic formula or basic format. For things like journal articles, magazines, websites, they're going to be slightly different, but it follows a kind of a similar order. The entry that you see here for TED Talk is super truncated. It's not actually full enough to present a good example, but I will show you full examples of all of these things so that you kind of have an idea of what yours should look like. And that's a really great strategy anyway, by the way, is anytime you have a sample MLA works cited page and you have something like that, or if you have a sample couple of entries, you can use that as a kind of an eyeball test against yours to see, do my entries look like this? Does the overall look of the assignment look like this? And it's especially useful for things like this for the bibliographic entries for each source. Before you submit your work for this assignment, it is important that you take a little bit of time to evaluate your annotated bibliography to make sure everything is correct, clear, and according to plan. So you do need to make sure, you need to check the structure and the format. Make sure that your thesis, your working thesis, is clearly stated at the beginning, because if it's not there, I can't evaluate your plan if I don't know what it has in mind. So a missing thesis will void the entire assignment. I have to know what your plan is to even be able to evaluate the source selection or your vision for those things. So check the structure, check the format. Ask yourself, are the citations in alphabetical order, and are they properly formatted in MLA citation style? You want to look at your summary quality, make sure that they're accurate, they're objective, that they're comprehensive enough, and that they're not too brief. So you really want to make sure that whoever is reading these has a true sense of the scope of the source and what the main arguments are in it, and that they have enough information to be able to evaluate the suitability of that. Then you also need to evaluate your original contribution. Sometimes students will be a little bit vague and they'll put all that in blue and it takes up space, but it doesn't really tell me much. So it's really important that the blue part is concrete, specific, and that you are explaining how you're using that source to develop a specific point or maybe even more than one point in your thesis, and showing that connection there. This is where you're going to demonstrate your critical thinking and your basic vision or your prevision for the paper. This annotated bibliography is a really crucial step, and it's supremely useful for when we create the outline for the paper. An outline has more detail. This kind of forces you to think through your basic vision and present that to me. But it sets the stage for you to be in better position to create a good outline that will guide your drafting and minimize or eliminate writer's block, which everybody's experienced and everybody hates. So, kind of think of the checklist items that you need to go through and go over those things before you submit the assignment. Okay, so now you have all the basic information and the how-to steps for how to create your annotated bibliography, but this is not all that I will collect in the submission link for the annotated bibliography. You'll also need to submit a process reflection, and this is required for all students, even if you didn't use AI to help you with the summaries. If you did use AI, you're going to want to make sure that you cited that correctly, as we discussed earlier, and you want to be transparent in your reflection about which parts of your work were AI assisted and how you engaged with the AI generated content. That's just meant to help you distill something that you're already familiar with, so you can spend more time on the higher order critical thinking skills of figuring out how you're going to use that source to develop specific points in your paper. I do have example reflections for you in the course, and these will also be visible inside the assignment link. So be sure, even before you work on the assignment, click inside there to make sure that you have downloaded or at least viewed the sample reflections, because that's kind of what yours should look like. They should have that level of detail. They should be formatted that way, and it's a really good exercise that should discuss a number of things, including your research process, the challenges you encountered, the frustrations, how you selected your sources, what you learned along the way. So this reflection is not part of the annotated bibliography itself, but it's an important part of the assignment, and it's a good learning tool as well. And I will ask you to do, some other things with this, but I'll leave that maybe for another video, and we'll maybe recap this, and then so that you can get started on the annotated bibliography. Okay, so let's recap the 4 key components of your annotated bibliography. The first thing you need is your working thesis. This is a single declarative sentence that will indicate which prompt you chose, and the specific things that you're contributing are the things that you have extracted from the sources that answer the research question that you chose, whether that's from one of the prompts that I gave you or from if you developed your own working thesis. All right, then we need the MLA entries. These are the 6 sources that are properly formatted with the bibliographic citations in MLA guidelines, and after each one of those there's a factual summary of each one in black font, and after that there is an original use explanation where you're explaining how you'll use each source and how whatever you're using connects to your thesis, and that part is in blue. So all of these things together will comprise your annotated bibliography. And just don't forget that you also need the reflection component also submitted in the assignment link. All right, so that's it. That's a wrap. And if you have any trouble or questions, please don't hesitate to reach out.